So we are still in Genesis chapter 3, and last week we looked a little bit more at sin, and more specifically what man tries to do with his sin. We talked about hiding it or diminishing it and those sorts of things. And then we looked at what God does about man's sin, and it's mentioned there briefly in Genesis chapter 3, but of course you and I know that he sends his son, and things happen on from there to where you and I can have redemption from our sin. We're going to keep talking about sin just a little bit more this morning, but more specifically here in verses 16 through 19, this idea of you reap what you sow, which is not pleasant for me to think about. It's probably not pleasant really for anyone to think about, at least in a negative context. It's nice when you're thinking of, hey, I've worked really hard in this and I'm going to reap what I sow. That's a great feeling. That's good to know. But when it comes to sin and negative things, you reap what you sow, and that's not pleasant to think about at all. Now, we talked about last week, man can be rescued from sin, particularly from the guilt even of his sin. But in most cases, there are still consequences for your sin. And that's where sowing and reaping is often misunderstood, because a lot of people think that because we can be forgiven of our sin, we don't have to face the consequences. Now, you're probably sitting there and thinking, well, Jeff, the consequences of sin is death, and Jesus defeats sin and defeats death, and through Christ you can defeat those things. So what do you mean consequences? Well, depending on the sin that you're doing and the things that you're involved in, there are earthly, sometimes immediate consequences for the sin that you're doing in your life, in the lives of people that you love. And even though you can be forgiven of those things, you certainly can through Christ. It really doesn't matter what. You can be forgiven of that sin. That doesn't mean those consequences are taken away. And those consequences can remain for many years. And in fact, here in Genesis chapter 3, the consequences of the sin that's happened here with Adam and Eve, those consequences are still around. For you and I today, the consequences of that sin are still there, which tells us a couple things. The consequences continue on, but also your sin may not just affect your life, but may go on to affect humanity. And we'll talk more specifically about that here in a moment. But that brings us back to this recurring theme of sin will always, always, always cost you something. So, verse 16... And I'll throw this over to you guys to see what you say. But to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall bring forth children. What do we think that means? What does that indicate to you, this consequence here? I'll say this, I'm not sure that what I just read is the best translation of that text. So if you have something different.
It's not the pain from childbirth.
Probably, right? Is there any other pain that he could be referring to? Maybe a little bit. It definitely seems to be more directed at childbirth, but it could be talking about being a parent and having children and the struggle of that, raising them, disappointment, mistakes, things like that. He says, I will greatly multiply your pain. So up to this point, Eve has not given birth, right? So does it hurt? And now he's just made it hurt more? Is there before this consequence, was childbirth a painful experience?
Nobody knows.
Do you think, sure, do you think that there's pain in the garden? Or paradise?
Shouldn't be.
Yeah, you wouldn't think so. Yeah. I guess I'm just bringing this up as something to think about. It's not like something deep that you really need to worry about. And also I'm not trying to, if you're a woman here who's given birth, I'm not trying to like kind of rub your nose in and be like, you know what, it should have been a painless process. And looky here. But yeah, again, I don't know that that's the best translation there of your pain will be greatly multiplied. Because I don't know that there was pain in that process to begin with, because that sounds strange in the garden or paradise for there to have been a painful process. And he says there at the end, in pain you shall bring forth children. And that, so then maybe it's one verse over the other. New Living Translation, just to throw this idea out there. Then he said to the woman, you will bear children with intense pain. And the word there indicates sorrow and suffering. So, as I said, prior to this, we have no record of Eve bearing children. But as a result of disobedience to God, when she does give birth to a child, she will experience intense pain, sorrow, and suffering in that process. And, of course, that consequence has been passed on to all women. I will tread lightly here, right, because I don't know what that feels like, nor will I ever. There's that story about a preacher who passed a kidney stone and made mention of that on a Sunday about how he understands now the pain. And when he returned to his office later that week, he found an 8-pound rock sitting on his table or on his desk. So I obviously don't know what that's like, nor will I know what that's like. There's not a man in this room that knows what that's like, and I'm willing to bet that there's not a man in this room that wants to know what that is like, to go through that. But the point that God seems to be making is almost from the very beginning of life, there is this reminder of, and we probably don't think about this, nor do I necessarily want you to, don't get me wrong, but there's this reminder in childbirth of the consequences of sin, the dangers of sin. Because this pain began from a consequence of sin, clear back in Genesis chapter 3. Like I said, I would never stand by like a woman who's just given birth and be like, did it hurt? Well, don't sin. I'm not going to, right, I wouldn't do that. I would be deserved to be kicked out of the hospital room because of that. Right, so I wouldn't do that. But it's almost a reminder of the pain and sorrow of childbearing that's being multiplied because of this consequence, reaping what they sowed. There was paradise, and now that paradise is lost to an extent. At the end of verse 16, this one's really tricky. Again, God speaking to the woman says, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. This one's not an easy verse to talk about. I don't know that I have all the right answers necessarily. Does anyone want to take a stab at what that consequence is and what that looks like? Your desire shall be for your husband, yet he will rule over you. This is now a consequence of their sin. No one wants to say anything. That's not fair, because then I have to say stuff. There's this idea here, and this one's tough. That woman would have a desire for her husband. This does come right after the childbirth thing. And again, this is not my best throw here, right? But this is right after listen, you're going to, every time you give birth to a child, is going to be incredibly painful and hurt, and you'll suffer through that. And then right after that is, and you'll continue to you'll desire your husband, and that will continue to happen. Perhaps it lends itself to that verse just before a little bit, right? Your desire will be for your husband, resulting in additional pain and suffering, other children, those sorts of things, right?
Well, isn't it kind of like other pain? You do get over it. You do.
Yeah, ladies, you get over it. No, but yeah, no, I know what you're saying. Yeah, you get over it. and again, I don't know, Frank, you and I don't necessarily know the turmoil of, Della gives birth to Dottie and she says, I want our kids to be a year apart. And then not long after having Dottie, she's like, we're going to take a break. we're gonna have a brief pause here. Just because, Dottie never sleeps and, that part, but also, some of the pain and the process of what she went through and however many hours or 40-something hours of labor or whatever it came down to. I get that. Yeah, and she'll move on and want to have more children, of course, but maybe. Another idea there, the word desire could potentially, and again, I'm spitballing here. You might disagree, and if you have something else to say, by all means. The desire there could potentially be you will desire to possess what man possesses.
The ESV
Yeah.
says, your desire shall be contrary to your husband,
Right.
but he shall rule over you.
Yeah, that's different from what I read here necessarily. Your desire shall be for your husband. Yeah, ESV says contrary.
Contrary.
But I think that kind of plays into this a little bit of this, and I think we're seeing that played out today to some degree, where as a woman you will want to possess, and again, what does man have? Well, according to this, he will rule over you, so there's this power struggle of I want that, you submit to me, there's this, I want to do these things, and we kind of have this battle of the sexes here, to an extent, right? And so part of the consequence of the sin may be what's being described here is God's, made woman, and here is this helper to her husband, and we'll talk more about this in detail, but it's an equal, right? We talked about, I can't remember when we did, recently, right? Helper, yes, but there's an equal role on both sides, but now the woman's contrary to her husband. And so where we had a relationship that was made a helper for the man working in tandem together, now there's this power struggle of the woman wants this over here, and then the man's going to rule over you, which is going to make you more frustrated or angrier or whatever that may be, thus more of a power struggle. So sin has kind of marred God's given desire to be a helper to her husband and perverted that desire into an urge to rival him for dominance. And you take a look at, and again, this is somewhat few and far between. I don't want to send you to the internet to look at stuff like this, but I see it all day long. But divorce and abuse and marital conflicts and, again, people who are lost in their sin, and as a result, the consequences, people getting married that probably shouldn't have gotten married in the first place, and then, again, physical, emotional, other kinds of abuse and things like that because they're contrary to each other, and that's part of the consequences of sin. That doesn't mean like, well, listen, God just made us to hate each other, so find someone to hate a little less, and marriage is just going to be miserable. Well, no, all of that is a consequence of sin. God has made marriage to work in this way. We talked about that a few lessons ago as well. Man is this way, woman is this way. They're meant to be together and work in this sense. If that's not happening, that's a consequence of sin and woman's desire being contrary. Again, anyways, that argument could be pretty strong there. Here's another explanation. The second half of that verse is, and he shall rule over you. And again, we already got into this, but prior to this, before the sin, Eve's relationship with man was she was equal to him, right? There was an assistance there. There was a helpmate. But evidently, he shall rule over you. There's this idea of dominion or subjection or submission in that sense. And so, again, this verse is tough. Scholars have differing opinions on what exactly is being described here. But what we do know and what we could walk away with is woman's sin has some kind of effect on her relationship with her husband. And that's still true today, certainly. No matter, we could take that beyond husband and wife too, even though that's what's being discussed here. Husband, wife, mom, child, father, child, brother, sister, neighbor, friend. Sin will always have an effect on your relationships with other people to some degree. And I would say every time in a negative way is sin going to have an effect in a relationship of yours. So then, moving on to verse 17, God says to the man, then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. Now, God is not saying, hey, in the future, don't listen to your wife. That's not an instruction to husbands to not listen to their wives. But what he is saying, and this will be important for the end of the lesson, what he's saying is that there is a voice that takes precedence over your wife's voice and any other voice, and that would be God's voice. So, Adam, because you listened to your wife, to the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you. So here he's saying, you should have listened to my voice. I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it. The NIV says, in painful toil you shall eat of it. All the days of your life. And then down in verse 19, God says, by the sweat of your face or your brow you shall eat bread. So we talked about this recently as well. Adam was working in the garden, and God had given Adam things to do. And we talked about how really work is a blessing. That feels really weird to say now in 2023, to say, man, I'm so glad that I have work. But it was a blessing. Adam had these things. He was a steward over these things. He took care of these things. He worked, and he got to enjoy God's creation and be a part of the maintaining of it and the sustaining of it. So the curse here is not that he has to work. That's not the consequence here. He's always had to work. The curse here is now it's going to be painful work. It's going to be hard work. He's going to walk away from that work tired and sore and weary. And yeah, that doesn't mean there isn't going to be great reward from that work, and it won't produce things from the ground, and that he won't have bread to eat and those sorts of things. And so there's like a small glimpse of, hey, I did this and we got food from it. And, we work hard today and hopefully still have some sense of reward and appreciation for what we're doing. But at the same time, how often when you're working is there disappointment and frustration and having to start over or having to move things somewhere else? That wasn't a part of work, and now it is. And again, I'm not telling you something that you don't already know. There are a lot of days, and again, we've talked about this recently, but I get a raise, I get a promotion, right? Which happens few and far between, but it happens, right? I get a promotion into something else that's exciting, that's more money, that's also more of my time, that's also a lot more paperwork on my desk, that's also a lot more meetings that I have to go to that really could have been an email, and so on. And so I come home tired and weary. And depending on what you're doing for work, right, your muscles may ache. And you might, I work an office job, so my muscles don't ache. But listen, those chairs, I don't care how ergonomic those things are. It's not comfortable. And I do have a standing desk as well. And honestly, the way our building is set up, I do multiple laps throughout the day. Just I'll put my phone down or step away from my desk and say, I'm taking a lap. Just kind of walk around or whatever. But yeah, my muscles do ache. Yeah, even from an office job. I get tired of sitting all day. That's not good for you. Staring at a computer all day. That's not good for you. And so you're tired of the workload. You're tired of the mental load. You're tired of the physical strain on your body. Yes, even from sitting at a computer and staring at a screen all day. And beyond that is this mental struggle of, listen, I work all day, I come home, I have dinner, I go to bed, and I know that tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up, get in my car, and go to the same place and do the same things and come back. And it becomes this endless cycle. And so maybe we change jobs, we go and work somewhere else to break up that cycle, to make things a little bit newer and exciting, and maybe that works for a little bit, but then pretty quickly you're going to experience the same weariness and tiredness. Frank?
There's no free lunch.
There's no free lunch. I like that. I'll have to use that this month. That's true.
You don't think you're the only one?
Well, and
Woman has as much stuff, the same thing every day.
Just teasing you, sir.
I just lost my place there.
Sorry, Ben.
No, you're fine. Okay, Frank was actually moving us into the next point there, so perfect timing.
Welcome.
You can't refuse to work because that's how you provide. There's no free lunch. Got to provide for your family. And listen, I'm happy to do it, and I prefer to do it, especially now that I have a child. You know, that was my goal before I even proposed to Della, and I told her parents that. I said, listen, one of these days I'm going to ask you out to dinner. I'm going to ask you if I can marry your daughter, but I'm not going to ask you that until I know that I can provide for us. And so I waited until I got a job that allowed me to provide. Okay, I can maintain, you know, house and other things for my wife. I will propose now. And then, you know, Metro was a big part of that blessing coming over here, because the day we accepted this position, you know, I told Della, you're done. If you want to be, right? I don't care. But I told her, I was like, listen, quit working. Just stop working and just be home and maintain that. And then, you know, again, God's provision, absolutely, you know, was we were struggling with having a child, and then I get a job at Metro, and then within, a year, she gets pregnant and said, well, now we're having a baby. So that's worked out wonderfully. But that's hard work. I do a lot of Metro-related things at my desk at my day job. I try to balance both most days throughout the week. That's tough. I spend a lot of my Saturdays sitting down, working on church stuff. It's a lot of hard work, but I can't not do it. I'm providing for my family. There's no free meals. So I've got to work. It has to be done. And that's a little bit part of paradise being lost. It's hard work. It's toil. I get tired. I get frustrated, you know. And so not only is work going to be more painful, but what God is saying here is the soil is now going to be a bit more uncooperative for you. Cursed is the ground because of you. And then verse 18, God says the ground will bring forth thorns and thistles. Creation has been devastated by sin. It's not just man. And you'll see that repeated in Romans chapter 8, this idea of the ground, of the earth kind of grumbling and moaning for change. Creation is devastated by sin. And so part of seeing those thorns and thistles and those things in your yard should remind you that paradise was lost, that there's consequences for sin. And then finally in verse 19, God says, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And so much for man's ambition for divinity, if there was any ambition for that. Satan says, eat of that fruit, and it's not that you'll die, it's that you'll be like God. And they eat of it, and the result here from God is, because you ate of it, you'll return to dust. So that didn't work out, did it? Right? We talked about there's no way to prove Satan wrong here unless you just do it, right? Well, they did it, and Satan was wrong. Because now God says you'll return to dust. And again, that's a constant reminder to all of us. And I've struggled with this. I don't know if that's common for someone my age, but in years past, I've really struggled with the idea of me dying. Right? Just kind of the sorrow and the impatience, and I don't want to die, and I don't want it to hurt, and that sort of thing. But it is a constant reminder, to have the consciousness of our mortality hanging over us. We will return to dust. And all of those consequences there are a reality for you until Jesus returns. And I hope this lesson doesn't kind of come across as depressing and foreboding, that there's just all this struggle and all these things and the creation, painful childbirth, contrary relationship between man and woman, and this power struggle and all these things. the truth is, it's the consequence for sin. It's reaping what was sown, and it's there for us to learn from. These things are meant to be a reminder for us of the consequences of man's sin. And so, just to kind of close, a few quick things, takeaways, lessons to learn from that. And the first one is this: be careful whose voice you're listening to. Right, that was brought up when God is talking to Adam and Eve, when he tells Adam, rather, because you listen to the voice of the woman. But Satan is going to, and does, try and fill your mind with all sorts of propaganda. He's going to try to convince you that you might be you may not be in paradise, but you may be in a good spot, but Satan will convince you that paradise is elsewhere. And you can find it, and you can get there by doing these things. If you'll listen to him, if you'll do what he says, if you'll try the stuff that he's offering to you, and if you go down the road he wants you to go down, if you'll do all that, you'll find paradise. His version of it or your version of it. And the purpose of these consequences that we still have today is to counter those subtle lies. Death and pain and toil and heartache, those are realities. They exist because man listened to Satan instead of the voice of God. And again, it's not like I'm going to tell Dottie, because when I grew up, I was terrified of storms. Didn't matter what it was. If it was loud enough, and if there was enough lightning and thunder, terrified. And it would not have helped me, nor do I think it would help Dottie, for God to say, this is God telling you, don't slip up. That wouldn't help me at all, right? I heard everything from, the thunder is, what is it, like angels bowling or something? It's when I don't know. You never heard that? Really, it was just Dad saying, like, we live in Edmond, nothing ever happens here, relax. And that also didn't help. But those things, now that I'm an adult, I can appreciate. And right, with rain, right, we need rain and those sorts of things. But you look at some of the tragedies that happen in creation and the things that are a part of this world, and that is the consequence on creation of sin, and should be a reminder of how powerful sin can be and how much it can deteriorate and throw things off. And so if you're a parent, by the way, that it matters then whether or not what voices you let your children listen to. Because if, at the very least, if you're indifferent to the voices that your kids listen to, then how many generations are going to pass before somebody down the line finally turns and listens to God again? And is that a heartache that you're willing to endure? The second one, we talked about this last week, but don't minimize sin. We have a real tendency to do that, to make it less than what it is. It's not a big deal. I don't hear anyone say this anymore, but I don't know what today's version of this would be, but, sowing your wild oats. They're young. You can afford to make mistakes and kind of go out there and, you'll learn. Got to let them do what they're going to do and see what happens, and so they know what not to get involved in. Who would have known that Adam and Eve deciding, okay, we will partake of this fruit, would have resulted in the things that it resulted in? And that brings us back around to the fact that our sin affects others. We talked about this last week as well, I think, in the sermon. But ultimately, your sin comes down to you. That's why you're doing it. It's because you have some desire, you want that desire filled, and so you go and you do that thing so that you can feel fulfilled or that you can be happy or whatever it is. I went and did what I wanted to do because it made me feel good. That's what sin ultimately comes down to. And so in that moment, you're probably thinking, if there are any consequences, I will deal with them because they will be dealt to me and I'll handle the consequences and we'll move on. Or depending on what the sin is or what it might be, I can afford that consequence. I'll ask for forgiveness and I can pay that money, or I can pay this fine, or I can go this place and do this thing. Thinking a lot about ourselves there, and we don't always stop to think about how could this particular sin affect other people. And we also have no idea to what proportion the sin that you're doing might have consequences for someone else and how that might affect them. Adam and Eve's sin has had an effect on all of mankind. That's tough, because listen, I don't know that you can do something right now that would have a consequence on all of mankind unless you, went and dropped a nuclear bomb. I guess that would have a consequence on most of mankind. There's really not something you can do like Adam and Eve that would have a consequence for all of mankind, where we still suffer the consequences today. But there are most certainly things that you can do today that will have an effect on your children, on your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, potentially beyond that. Glenn?
I was just going to say about that, God has the ability to forgive us of sin and He'll remember it no more. It's gone.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We don't have that capability.
That's true.
Sometimes I'll hear a song or I'll drive by a place or something that reminds me of the old man I used to be. And it's just like running a sword through me.
Mm.
That'll be with me till I go to my grave, how I used to live.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. God remembers no more. Those things no longer tallied against you in Christ. That doesn't mean that I or you have the ability to remember no more, which is unfortunate. And I don't like getting into this. One of these days, like I said, we'll have a series on marriage and divorce and those sorts of things. But listen, my parents' divorce, and more specifically, my mom's side of things, that has affected my childhood. That affected my marriage. Things that I didn't realize until the last year. So that this moment where she said, I'm going to go and I'm going to do this, that's affected her marriage. It affected her children. It's affected her children's marriage. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea of, I have nieces and nephews who don't understand who she is because she's not there. And so when they do see her once a year, it's, who is that again? And having to explain eventually to Dottie, well, technically that is my mom. But, right, and so that's tough, having to explain that to my daughter, who won't understand it until she does. And when she does, that's going to be tough to really fully explain to her, well, here's what happened and here's why you don't know her. And who knows what effect that could have on Dottie. I don't know. But you just see, do I think that my mom thought of those things when she was doing what she was doing? Definitely not. Definitely not. And I'm not just saying that to dogpile on my mom. Are there things that I have done, or are there things that I can do that could affect my wife, my daughter, any future children? And could I affect Dottie in such a way that it affects her future marriage and her future children? Absolutely. I can. I could do something like that. But we minimize sin because it's just about us and we can afford it this one time and we can whatever. And that's not always true. And finally, because of sin, it's destined for all men to die. From dust we came, to dust we will return. And so we have to consider what is the result of dying under the curse of sin. Verse 24, Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden. Access to the garden, access to the tree of life is blocked for them. And so unless they somehow gain access to the garden, into the tree of life, paradise is lost forever. They are lost forever. And so how can Adam and Eve remove this consequence, specifically death? They can't. There's not anything they can do. Galatians chapter 3, we'll end there. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. The curse of the law being when you disobey what God says. That's what Adam and Eve did. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everything, or is everyone, rather, who hangs on a tree. Jesus is the one who will ultimately remove, and did remove the curse for you and I, and it's only by God's grace and mercy that could happen. And through Christ's willingness to die on a cross, and then our faith and obedience as a result of that faith to him, that anyone will ever gain access to the tree of life and to the paradise that's been lost. trying to decide if I want to end there or not. Something else to think about, I guess, is I wonder if it had ever dawned on Satan. And again, Job is a really common place to go back to as we've been going through this study. But I wonder if it ever dawned on Satan the length that God would go to redeem his children. I will send my son. I will put him on the cross. He will take on that curse. He will take on all those consequences. He'll die for it. Something to think about, if that had ever dawned on Satan. And additionally, has that ever dawned on you? The great lengths that God would go to. The last 2 chapters of Revelation, there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. That's 21. And chapter 2 says that the reason will be because there will no longer be a curse. Anyways, that's all I got this morning, unless there's any thoughts or questions. All right, thanks, y'all.